Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The first memory arrived as most do, fragment and feeling before sense. Cold water shocking small hands, the wooden bucket heavy, too heavy, sloshing against bare legs as the child struggled up 3 warped steps into the kitchen where mother worked. This was the rhythm before words. Haul, scrub, carry, sweep. The tavern taught its lessons early. Father kept the place the way a farmer keeps rocky soil, coaxing what little yield he could from hard ground. The building hunched beside the trade road like something grown from the earth itself, all dark timber and fieldstone, the kind of structure that looked tired even when new. Inside smelled of wood smoke and yesterday's stew and the sour tang of spilled ale worked into floorboards no amount of scrubbing could sweeten. But it was home, the only home. Mother sang while she worked. Not proper songs with beginnings and ends, just fragments of melody that drifted through rooms like weather. Her hands never stopped moving, kneading dough, stirring pots, wringing linens, mending tears in rough fabric. She taught the child to read the tavern's moods, how to spot a drunk turning mean before fists flew, which travelers wanted conversation, and which wanted silence with their meal, when to make yourself invisible. The travelers came in waves dictated by season and rumor, merchants hauling goods to settlements farther north, farmers bringing produce to market. Occasionally someone better dressed, speaking with the clipped authority of education or colonial appointment. Father treated these last with special care, the kind that looked like respect, but tasted like fear when you watched closely. He taught this lesson without speaking it. Those with power notice only when displeased. Old Samuel appeared one autumn when the child had perhaps 9 or 10 years. He came as a lodger who paid weekly in small coins and sometimes in labor, mending harness or fixing the perpetually troublesome shutter on the north wall. He had fought in some earlier conflict, the details shifted in his telling, and carried himself with the particular stillness of men who had seen violence enough to recognize its approach. In evenings, he told stories to whoever would listen. The child listened. Through Samuel's tales, the wider world took shape. Cities beyond the colonies, ships crossing impossible distances, wars fought for reasons that sounded important in the telling, but dissolved into confusion when examined closely. He spoke of things seen and things heard, and the child learned there was often little difference between the two in how they shaped a life. When the fever came, it moved through the settlement like something with intention. 3 families lost children that autumn. The widow Morrison lasted 4 days before the coughing stopped. Mother fought it longer, nearly 2 weeks, thrashing in the small room behind the kitchen where the family slept. Father tried every remedy, every poultice, every prayer borrowed from neighbors who claimed to know such things. The child watched, understanding nothing except that the singing had stopped. After the burial, Father grew quieter, not silent. The tavern still needed managing, but something had emptied from behind his eyes. He taught the child everything now with grim efficiency: how to tap a cask without wasting a drop, the difference between spoiled meat and meat merely aged, how to calculate portions so travelers left satisfied but not so full they lingered when you needed the table. Mathematics arrived through necessity. This many potatoes feed this many mouths. This much grain costs this much coin. Debts accumulate at this speed. The child learned to read people the way others read books. That merchant, touching his purse every few minutes, had been robbed before. That farmer laughing too loud was afraid of something. That well-dressed traveler, asking too many questions about the road ahead, was running from debts, or family, or both. These small observations became armor against a world that felt increasingly complicated and dangerous. Humor helped. Not the practiced wit of educated folk, but the quick deflection of someone who learned early that making others laugh made them less likely to strike. A joke about burnt porridge, a self-deprecating comment about mud tracked across clean floors. Small offerings that cost nothing, but sometimes earned a larger coin left on the table, or patience when mistakes happened. The work filled hours until hours became years. Hauling firewood in winter until hands cracked and bled, serving meals to men who sometimes grabbed at wrists with rough familiarity. Learning which advances to deflect with humor and which required Father's presence. Scrubbing pots until arms ached. Changing linens in rented rooms upstairs, where sometimes travelers had died quietly in the night, and sometimes had simply left without paying. Father spoke of the road's reputation when the child reached perhaps 15 years. Certain stretches were known as dangerous, not merely from weather or difficult terrain, but from something else. Robberies, though no one could say exactly where or when. Occasionally, someone would fail to reach their destination. Explanations varied. Wolves, though wolves rarely attacked healthy adults. Bandits, though no organized gang was ever found. Simple misfortune, which covered every possibility no one wanted to name directly. The child absorbed this knowledge the way one absorbs warnings about spoiled food or unstable ice. Danger existed. Vigilance mattered. But life continued regardless, because stopping meant starving, and starving was a certainty while danger remained merely possible. Old Samuel left one spring without ceremony or farewell. Simply gone one morning, his small pack of belongings vanished from the corner where he'd slept. Father accepted this without comment. People moved through the tavern like weather through seasons. Permanence was an illusion, afforded only to those who owned the ground beneath them. Dreams arrived in quiet moments, perhaps owning more land, perhaps expanding the stable to accommodate more horses, perhaps simply reaching a point where worry about the next meal faded into something less immediate and consuming. These dreams stayed small and practical, because large dreams required resources that felt impossibly distant. But they persisted nonetheless. Quiet hopes that made the daily labor feel like progress towards something rather than simple repetition until death. The child became someone capable, not remarkable, not destined for anything beyond this life of service and management, but capable, strong enough to haul barrels, quick enough to avoid most trouble. Clever enough to navigate the invisible rules, separating those who served from those who ruled. And slowly, without announcement or ceremony, childhood ended, and something else began. Father's cough started the winter everything changed. Not the dramatic consumption that felled people in weeks, but the grinding kind that stripped strength slowly, like water wearing stone. By spring, he could no longer lift the grain sacks. By summer, he spent more time seated than standing. The tavern's operation shifted to younger shoulders without discussion or ceremony. At 19, the responsibility felt less like inheritance and more like drowning in shallow water. Every decision carried weight Father had made look effortless. Too much salt in the stew, and travelers complained. Too little firewood ordered, and winter could kill the business along with its occupants. The margins were thin as parchment, and mistakes showed immediately in the coin box that determined whether they ate adequately or sparingly. Margaret arrived, looking for work that autumn. Not young, perhaps 30, but sturdy and competent in the way that mattered more than age. She had worked in households, she said, before the family she served moved south to warmer colonies. Her references seemed solid enough, and the tavern needed help desperately. She started the next day, taking over the kitchen with an efficiency that made the previous chaos embarrassing in retrospect. She worked without excessive conversation, which felt like blessing after the parade of chatterboxes who had failed to last more than weeks. But she noticed things. When provisions ran low before expected, when a traveler seemed unwell and needed gentler food, when Father's coughing fits grew worse and someone needed to help him to his room without making spectacle of his weakness. She handled these observations quietly, solving problems before they required announcement. The tavern stabilized under their shared management. Not prosperous. Prosperity felt like a word from another language, but stable. Travelers came with seasonal regularity. The roof stopped leaking in 3 places after repairs that consumed an entire month's profit. The stew became known as decent, which in tavern terms meant people ordered second bowls. Small victories accumulated like coins in a jar. Father died in his sleep on a cold morning in late winter. The doctor said his heart simply stopped, worn out from years of labor and perhaps from grief that never fully healed after Mother's death. The burial took place quickly, attended by a handful of regulars who had known him, and the Reverend, who performed such services for a small fee. Standing beside the grave, the weight of true ownership settled like a yoke. The tavern became fully theirs through documents signed with help from the village clerk. The previous owner's heir, some distant cousin who had never visited, accepted a modest payment to relinquish any claim. It felt strange to own something so completely, to know that every decision's consequence belonged entirely to the one making it. Freedom and trap lived in the same deed. William Chen appeared that spring as merchants do, arriving with goods and departing with coin. But he returned more frequently than most, and his roots seemed to bend toward this particular tavern more than geography required. He was unusual, the son of a Chinese father and English mother, he said, carrying the visible evidence of both lineages and the social complications that accompanied such mixing. Perhaps this shaped his easy friendliness, or perhaps he was simply that rare person who found genuine interest in others. He brought news with his goods, stories from other settlements. Information about which roads had washed out and which remained passable. Rumors about colonial politics that felt distant, but somehow still mattered. And gradually, carefully, he brought friendship. The kind that developed through repeated encounters rather than sudden declaration. Meals shared after business concluded. Conversations that wandered beyond transaction into actual exchange of thought. Margaret watched this developing friendship with something that might have been approval or might have been wariness. She remained careful with her own trust, offering competence and reliability, but keeping her interior life guarded. Yet slowly, through months of shared work and shared purpose, something shifted between them as well. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Two people who understood what it meant to build something from insufficient materials and to keep building, even when exhaustion suggested surrender. The tavern grew into its potential by small degrees. A new stable, built with lumber purchased over 2 seasons. Better mattresses upstairs that earned reputation for decent sleep. A selection of spirits beyond the cheapest available, which attracted travelers with slightly heavier purses. Each improvement required calculation. This much investment should return this much profit over this much time. Mathematics governed everything, cold and unforgiving as January wind. But within those calculations lived possibility, a future that looked different from the present. Not transformation, that felt like fantasy, but improvement. Enough coin to weather bad seasons. Enough reputation to attract steady custom. Perhaps eventually enough security to imagine something beyond simple survival. These thoughts arrived during quiet moments, dangerous in their hopefulness, but persistent nonetheless. The road's darker reputation continued as background noise. Occasionally, someone would mention a traveler who failed to arrive at their destination. Sometimes, wreckage of a wagon found abandoned. Sometimes, nothing at all, just absence where presence had been expected. The explanations remained vague and varied. Wilderness held dangers. Travel involved risk. Misfortune struck randomly. These truths were acknowledged and then set aside because dwelling on them changed nothing. William mentioned during one visit that similar incidents occurred along other routes as well. Not epidemic, but persistent, like low fever that never quite broke. He spoke carefully, noting patterns without drawing conclusions. Certain roads seemed more troubled than others. Certain seasons brought more disappearances. But the colonial authorities paid little attention unless someone important vanished. And important people rarely traveled alone or poorly guarded. Margaret's presence became essential rather than merely helpful. She managed the kitchen entirely now, developing her own relationships with suppliers and her own methods for stretching provisions. She handled difficult customers with a directness that sometimes shocked, but always worked. And gradually, through glances held slightly too long and conversations that extended past necessity, something unspoken grew between them. The declaration came without poetry or planning. A late evening after a particularly exhausting day, sitting in the kitchen after the last traveler had gone upstairs. Margaret simply stated she had grown fond of this place and intended to stay. And if the proprietor felt similarly about her presence, perhaps they could formalize the arrangement. The proposal's practicality made it no less significant. They married the following month in a brief ceremony that felt right in its simplicity. Marriage changed less than expected and more than imagined. The work continued identically, but the work felt different, shared fully rather than merely divided. Planning stretched further into the future now. Decisions considered two perspectives instead of one. And in quiet moments, the loneliness that had lived in the background since childhood finally, quietly, receded. The tavern became truly theirs in a way documents could not capture. Every floorboard knew their footsteps. Every pot had been scrubbed by their hands. Every corner held memory of labor and small triumph. This was the life built from nothing but effort and stubborn persistence. Not easy, never easy, but theirs. And for a while, that felt like enough. The merchant arrived on a Tuesday in early autumn, when the air carried that particular crispness that promised hard winter ahead. He wore good wool and better boots, the kind that marked him as successful without proclaiming wealth loudly enough to invite trouble. His horse showed quality breeding. His saddlebags hung heavy with the weight of goods or coin or both. He paid for a room, a meal, and stabling without haggling, which itself was noteworthy. Over supper he spoke little, responding to pleasantries with distracted courtesy. But his eyes moved constantly, checking the door, the windows, the other travelers sharing the common room. When Margaret brought his second ale, he asked about the northern road. How far to the next settlement? Were there farms along the way, or long stretches of forest? Had she heard of any trouble recently? She answered honestly. 2 days' travel, if weather held. Some farms in the first day's journey, then heavier woods. As for trouble, well, the roads were never entirely safe, were they? He nodded slowly, seeming to weigh her words against some private calculation. Then he thanked her and returned to his meal, though he ate little. In the morning he departed at first light, declining the offer of packed provisions. He seemed eager to be gone, or perhaps eager to reach his destination before darkness caught him in the forest. His departure felt unremarkable at the time. Dozens of travelers came and went each month, each carrying their own worries and destinations. He was simply one more. The news arrived 2 weeks later through a farmer who had found the body. 3 miles north on the forest stretch, just off the road where the pines grew thick. Stripped of valuables, left for scavengers. The farmer had recognized the horse wandering riderless and followed the trail back. Constable Peters rode out, examined the scene, and returned with theories about bandits or possibly an animal attack, though the body's conditions suggested human violence rather than predator. The merchant's name had been Thomas Garrett. He left a widow in Boston and 2 daughters. This information arrived through William, who had known him slightly through mercantile networks. Garrett had been successful, careful, experienced in travel, not the sort to take foolish risks or advertise his wealth carelessly. Yet the road had taken him anyway. Something about this death felt different from the abstract rumors that floated through the tavern regularly. This man had sat in that chair, eaten from that bowl, slept in that bed upstairs. His nervousness had been visible, real, and entirely justified. The knowledge sat heavy in the chest, like a stone swallowed accidentally. Sleep came poorly for several nights. The mind replayed the brief conversation, searching for something missed, some warning that should have been given, or action that should have been taken. But what action? The roads were dangerous. Everyone knew this. Travelers made their choices and accepted their risks. The tavern's responsibility ended at its walls. This was the logic that should have brought comfort, but somehow failed to. Margaret noticed the distraction but said little at first. She managed her domain with usual efficiency, while watching her partner wrestle with something she could not quite name. Finally, over a quiet evening meal, she asked directly what troubled the mind so thoroughly. The answer came slowly, pieced together from fragments of thought that had not quite organized themselves into coherent concern. It was not just Garrett. It was the pattern emerging when you paid attention. Last spring, a peddler failed to reach his destination. Summer before that, 2 trappers vanished on the northern route. The previous autumn, a young couple traveling to join family. None of these incidents had seemed connected at the time. Each carried its own explanation. But viewed together, they formed something more troubling than random misfortune. Margaret listened without interrupting, then offered her own observation. 3 other incidents had occurred in the past 2 years that might fit the pattern. A merchant's son, a widow traveling to live with her brother, a craftsman carrying tools and savings. All had stayed at the tavern. All had taken the northern road. All had disappeared or been found dead. The incidents were spaced far enough apart that they had registered as separate tragedies rather than connected events. The realization settled between them like winters settling over the landscape. Something was happening on that stretch of road, something persistent and predatory. And somehow, impossibly, the tavern seemed connected to each incident, not through fault, what could have been done differently, but through proximity. Every victim had passed through these doors. Constable Peters proved unhelpful when approached. He was a practical man, overwhelmed by practical concerns, livestock theft, boundary disputes, the occasional drunken violence that required official attention. He had neither time nor inclination to investigate a series of deaths that might be connected, or might simply be the inevitable result of dangerous travel in difficult territory. Highway robbery happened, wild animals killed occasionally, accidents occurred. Unless someone could provide specific evidence of specific crime by specific criminal, he had more pressing matters demanding attention. The decision to investigate privately came without dramatic declaration. It began simply as paying closer attention, noting which travelers took which roads, recording descriptions and destinations, asking casual questions about their routes and timing. The small leather journal appeared, its pages gradually filling with dates and names and details that seemed insignificant individually, but might reveal pattern collectively. Daniel arrived looking for work that same autumn. Young, perhaps 22, with the easy smile of someone who had learned to make himself likable quickly. He had worked at other establishments, he said, and knew the tavern trade reasonably well. His references seemed adequate, and the business had grown busy enough to justify additional help. He started the following week. He proved remarkably capable. Quick to learn preferences and routines. Good with horses, which mattered considerably given the stable's importance to revenue. Friendly with travelers without being intrusive, and genuinely helpful in ways that went beyond his assigned duties. When the northern shutter came loose in a storm, he repaired it without being asked. When supplies ran low, he volunteered to make the trip to the village. small actions that accumulated into significant value. Margaret approved of him, which carried weight. She was not easy to impress, having seen too many workers who showed well initially, then disappointed once comfortable. But Daniel maintained his effort and attitude through weeks that became months. He seemed genuinely interested in learning the business thoroughly, asking questions about suppliers and pricing and the 100 small details that separated successful operation from failure. William brought disturbing news during his next visit. Similar disappearances were occurring along other routes in the region. Not identical patterns, the roads and circumstances varied, but the same essential story. Travelers vanishing. Bodies occasionally found stripped of valuables. Explanations that satisfied official inquiries but left questions unanswered for anyone paying closer attention. The scope of the problem was wider than initially imagined. The three of them sat together, discussing what they knew, what they suspected, and what could be done. William had access to information from his travels. Margaret noticed details about travelers that others missed. And the proprietor's growing obsession with the pattern had generated considerable documented observation. Together, they began to see something that individually they might have dismissed. The victims shared characteristics. They traveled alone or in very small groups. They carried visible signs of modest wealth. They stayed at establishments along the route rather than camping. They were not important enough that their disappearance would trigger serious official investigation. And they all, every single one that could be confirmed, had stopped at certain taverns and inns along their route. The pattern suggested someone was selecting victims carefully, using information gathered at these stopping points. This realization brought no comfort. If the theory held truth, then every innkeeper along these routes might be unwittingly providing information to whoever was responsible. Or worse, one or more might be willing participants. The thought felt like betrayal of basic hospitality. The tavern was supposed to be sanctuary, however temporary. A place where travelers could rest safely before continuing their dangerous journeys. If that safety was illusion, if the very act of seeking shelter marked you for violence, then something fundamental had corrupted. The investigation became more deliberate. Notes grew more detailed. Conversations with travelers probed more carefully for information about their routes and experiences. Letters were written to other innkeepers, asking careful questions about their own experiences with disappeared guests. Some replies came back confirming similar incidents. Others never replied at all, which might mean nothing or might mean everything. Winter approached with its usual certainty. The roads would become more dangerous from weather alone. Travel would slow but not stop entirely. And somewhere out there, someone was hunting people who were simply trying to reach their destinations safely. The knowledge sat like a weight that could not be set down, growing heavier with each passing day. Daniel proved increasingly valuable as the investigation demanded more time and attention. He managed daily operations competently, freeing up hours for the careful, tedious work of documentation and correspondence. He asked about the investigation occasionally, showing appropriate concern without prying. When told about the suspected pattern, he seemed genuinely troubled, and offered to help however possible. His loyalty felt reassuring in circumstances that increasingly suggested betrayal lurked somewhere in the network of trust that made travel and trade possible. Spring arrived with mud and melt and the resumption of heavier traffic along the trade routes. The investigation had become a second occupation now, consuming hours that should have gone to tavern management. The leather journal had grown thick with entries, each page documenting travelers, their descriptions, their stated destinations, their actual arrivals or troubling absences. Patterns emerged and dissolved and reformed in ways that suggested meaning without quite revealing it. Margaret's patience wore visibly thinner as weeks passed. Not with the investigation itself, she understood the moral weight driving it, but with the toll it extracted. Meals eaten, distracted, conversations half-heard. The quality of presence that makes a marriage more than mere cohabitation slowly eroding under the pressure of obsession. She tried speaking of it directly once, choosing words carefully to avoid sounding unsupportive. The response came defensive and distant, proving her point more effectively than argument could have. The business suffered in small ways that accumulated. Supplies ordered late, a broken door hinge left unrepaired for weeks, the stable needing attention that kept getting deferred. Nothing catastrophic, but the slow decline visible to anyone paying attention. Daniel compensated admirably, catching problems before they became crises, but even his capability had limits. The tavern required its owner's full attention, and full attention had become impossible to provide. William's visits brought information that deepened, rather than resolved, the mystery. He had traveled extensively through the region, asking careful questions of other merchants and innkeepers. The disappearances clustered around certain routes, but not exclusively. They occurred with disturbing regularity, but no predictable timing. Victims ranged from moderately wealthy to merely comfortable, suggesting the motive was profit, but not exclusively greed. Some bodies were found, some never. Some victims fought back, evidence of struggle, while others seemed taken by surprise. What troubled William most, he confided during a late evening conversation, was the efficiency. Whoever was responsible had operated for years without capture or serious investigation. They knew the roads intimately. They understood which victims would be missed and which would generate only cursory official concern. They had access to information about travelers that suggested either remarkable observation or inside knowledge from establishments where travelers lodged. The sophistication implied organization rather than opportunistic violence. This theory had occurred independently, but hearing it confirmed by someone with wider perspective made it more real and more frightening. If an organized group was selecting victims systematically, using information gathered from taverns and inns, then the scope of the operation was far larger than highway robbery. It was predation, conducted with business-like planning. And somewhere in that system, someone was feeding information about vulnerable travelers to those who would kill them for profit. The question that haunted sleep and waking hours alike was simple and terrible. Could someone at this very tavern be involved? The thought felt like betrayal to even entertain. Margaret was beyond suspicion. Her character, her transparent honesty, her genuine distress at the situation. Daniel seemed equally impossible to doubt. His helpfulness, his concern, his willingness to assist with the investigation itself. William's friendship had been tested over years, yet someone, somewhere in the network of establishments and workers and regular travelers, was compromised. Trust had become both essential and dangerous. Reverend Shaw visited one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a traveling minister's upcoming visit, but really to express concern. The change in demeanor had been noticed, the distraction during services, the obsessive quality that neighbors remarked upon with worry. He spoke gently about the limits of individual responsibility, about accepting that some evils were too large for one person to address, about the danger of letting pursuit of justice consume the life meant to be lived. His words came from genuine care and were ignored with polite thanks. Two families arrived seeking lodging that night. The Winstons, traveling north to join relatives who had established a farmstead, and the Porters, returning south after visiting a dying parent. Ordinary travelers with ordinary reasons for travel. Yet now, every guest arrived wearing the invisible possibility of becoming a victim. The weight of that knowledge made simple hospitality feel like participation in some cruel selection process. The temptation to warn every traveler felt overwhelming and impossible. Warn them of what exactly? That roads were dangerous? They knew this already. That someone might be watching them? Paranoia was no gift to travelers already facing genuine hardships. That stopping at taverns might mark them for violence? This would destroy the business and leave travelers with even fewer options for safety. The silence felt like complicity, but speech felt like madness. Margaret found her partner standing in the stable after midnight, ostensibly checking on horses, but really just standing motionless in the dark. She asked no questions, simply stood beside in the cold until the shivering became too much to ignore. Walking back to the warmth, she spoke quietly about the need to choose. Not between investigation and tavern, but between controlled dedication and destructive obsession. The investigation could continue, but it could not consume everything. Some part of life had to remain protected, or there would be nothing left worth protecting. The words penetrated in ways previous attempts had not. Perhaps because they came in darkness and exhaustion, rather than during defensive daylight. Perhaps because they acknowledged the importance of the work, while naming its cost. The promise made there in the cold was tentative but sincere. More balance, more presence. The investigation would continue, but not at the expense of the marriage or the business that sustained them both. Daniel noticed the shift in the following days and seemed pleased. He had worried, he said, about the toll the investigation was taking. He understood the importance, but feared it was eating away at the stability that made the tavern successful. His concern seemed genuine, his relief at the renewed focus on daily operations evident in his more relaxed demeanor. Letters continued arriving from other innkeepers in response to earlier inquiries. Most confirmed similar experiences with disappeared travelers. A few mentioned their own suspicions about patterns. One letter, from an establishment 3 days' ride west, included detailed observations that matched closely with the documented patterns. The correspondent suggested meeting to share information more thoroughly. The invitation went unanswered for weeks, the energy required for such travel feeling impossible to summon. The spring progressed with its usual demands. Planting season brought farmers through with their particular needs and rhythms. Merchants moved goods along established routes. The occasional colonial official passed through, carrying news of policies and taxes that affected commerce without improving it. Life continued its patterns, and within those patterns, the investigation continued as well, but more quietly now, less consuming. William brought word of another disappearance during a late spring visit. A leather worker traveling alone, last seen at an inn 2 days north. His tools were found scattered in the forest, valuable enough that their abandonment suggested violence rather than simple desertion. The constables had been notified. The official response would be predictable. Unfortunate, but not uncommon. Probably robbery, little to be done. Travelers assume risks. The pattern continued. Margaret had begun keeping her own observations, noting things from her perspective that might be missed from another angle. Which travelers seemed nervous and which confident? Who asked questions about road conditions and who seemed to already know? Small details that individually meant nothing, but collectively might reveal something. Her involvement brought both comfort and concern. Comfort in shared burden. Concern that the obsession might be spreading rather than healing. Daniel's helpfulness extended to the investigation itself now. He offered to ride out to examine one of the sites where a body had been found, looking for anything the constables might have missed. He suggested questions to ask travelers that might reveal useful information. He volunteered to maintain the records when other duties demanded attention. His enthusiasm for the work seemed to match his enthusiasm for tavern operation, which felt like blessing and loyalty. The marriage stabilized without fanfare. Small moments of connection re-established. Conversations that went beyond logistics and worry. The occasional laughter that had become rare during the worst of the obsessive period. Margaret's forgiveness came not through declaration, but through gradual restoration of warmth that had temporarily withdrawn. Trust, once stressed, required time to fully repair, but the healing had begun. Yet, beneath the surface calm, the mystery deepened. More information meant more questions. The scale of the operation suggested multiple people working in coordination. The longevity suggested careful planning and local knowledge. The success rate suggested either remarkable luck or inside assistance. And somewhere in all the accumulated observations and theories, the answer waited, hidden in plain sight like a word you cannot quite remember, but know you know. Summer approached with its heat and insects and long days. The tavern settled into familiar rhythms, while the investigation continued its patient, frustrating work. The leather journal grew heavier with each entry. The pile of correspondence thickened. And somewhere on the roads that connected settlements and lives, the predation continued, invisible to those who preferred not to see. The journey to meet the innkeeper from the western settlement finally happened in mid-summer, when roads were dry and travel least treacherous. William agreed to accompany, his presence providing both companionship and the merchant's practiced eye for observing routes and establishments. Margaret stayed to manage the tavern with Daniel's assistance, her farewell carrying equal measures of support and quiet concern about this expanding pursuit. The Western Inn sat beside a smaller trade route, less trafficked than the main road, but still vital to the scattered farms and settlements it connected. Its keeper was a woman named Sarah Hutchins, perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered competence of someone who had survived multiple husbands and learned to depend primarily on herself. She welcomed them with the careful hospitality shown to strangers who might become allies or might become complications. Over evening meal, she shared her observations. 4 disappearances in 3 years, all following similar patterns. Solo travelers or small groups. Visible but not ostentatious wealth. All had stayed at her establishment before vanishing on the northward road. She had contacted the constable repeatedly, receiving the same dismissive responses about the inevitable dangers of wilderness travel. Her frustration matched and perhaps exceeded what had been felt miles away at another tavern facing similar mysteries. What made her account particularly valuable was her detail. She had maintained careful records going back years, noting not just the disappeared, but all travelers who had passed through, their characteristics, their destinations, even snippets of conversation that seemed potentially relevant. Her pages, when laid beside the leather journal carried from home, showed patterns that became impossible to dismiss as coincidence. William studied both sets of records with the methodical attention he brought to commercial negotiations. The victims shared more than general characteristics. Their timing aligned with particular seasons when travel was heaviest, and thus when disappearances would blend more easily into general road dangers. None had family traveling with them. None were expected urgently at their destinations. They were people whose absence would be noted eventually, but not immediately. The selection was too consistent to be random chance. Sarah had her own theory, developed through years of observation and bitter experience. She believed someone was watching the roads and the establishments along them, noting potential victims, and passing information to whoever executed the attacks. The watcher could be a traveler who moved frequently enough to observe multiple locations, or it could be someone stationary who received information from accomplices. Either way, the system required coordination and communication more sophisticated than simple highway robbery. The 3 of them sat late into the night, comparing experiences and suspicions. Sarah mentioned other innkeepers she knew who had suffered similar patterns. William added information from merchant networks about routes where traders had learned to travel only in large, well-armed groups. The scope that emerged was larger than any single constable's jurisdiction, larger perhaps than any single colonial authority wanted to acknowledge. Admitting such organized predation existed meant admitting the authorities' inability to control it. The return journey provided time for reflection and darker thoughts. If the pattern was truly this widespread, if it had operated this long without serious investigation, then either the colonial authorities were criminally incompetent, or they had decided the cost of addressing it exceeded their interest in protecting common travelers. Neither possibility offered comfort. The roads existed to serve commerce and settlement, but they also served as hunting grounds for those who understood how to exploit their dangers. William spoke carefully during a rest stop, choosing words with obvious deliberation. He had been thinking about who could operate such a system successfully. It required local knowledge across a wide territory. It required the ability to move or communicate without drawing attention. It required knowing which travelers were vulnerable and which were protected. The more he considered the requirements, the more it seemed the perpetrators must be people embedded in the very trade and travel networks they exploited. Perhaps merchants, perhaps drovers, perhaps workers who moved between establishments, people who belonged on the roads and whose presence attracted no suspicion. This theory aligned too well with private fears to be comfortable. The thought that someone trusted, someone familiar, someone whose presence felt normal, might be betraying travelers to violence made the whole enterprise of hospitality feel poisoned. Yet the logic was sound. Strangers drew attention. Familiar figures did not. And the familiar figures who moved most freely through the network of roads and establishments were those whose business justified constant travel. Arriving home brought relief mixed with anxiety. The tavern had functioned well in absence, Margaret and Daniel managing the operation with their usual competence. But the brief time away had created distance that made the familiar suddenly feel less certain. Small details stood out. The way Daniel asked questions about the trip, his interest in what Sarah had shared, his suggestions about who else might be contacted for information. Nothing overtly suspicious, but nothing quite innocent either, once suspicion had been invited. Margaret noticed the change in demeanor immediately and asked privately what had happened during the journey. The answer came in pieces, the theory and its implications spilling out in the quiet of their room. She listened without interrupting, her face showing the same troubled processing. When pressed for her own thoughts, she admitted she had occasionally wondered about travelers who passed through regularly. Not Daniel specifically, but others. The peddler who came monthly. The drover who moved livestock along the routes. The occasional drifter who found work for a season, then moved on. Any of them could be observing and reporting without drawing attention. The investigation shifted toward watching the watchers, paying attention not just to travelers, but to those who interacted with travelers, noting who asked questions and what kinds, observing who took interest in which guests and why. The paranoia this created was exhausting and probably unfair to innocent people, but the alternative was continuing to operate blindly while victims accumulated. Silas Burke arrived in late summer, drifting into the area, looking for harvest work. He was rough in appearance and manner, the kind of person who seemed to carry visible history of violence and hardship. He found work at a nearby farm and became a semi-regular at the tavern, drinking alone and speaking little. His presence created unease, not through specific action, but through general demeanor that suggested danger poorly contained. When another disappearance occurred that autumn, a tinker who had stayed at the tavern 2 days before vanishing on the northern route, suspicion immediately fixed on Burke. He had been present when the tinker stopped. He had been seen on the northern road around the relevant time frame. He had visible means to commit violence and no apparent means to support himself beyond occasional labor. The logic felt compelling, the relief of having a specific suspect nearly overwhelming. The confrontation happened in the tavern's common room, poorly planned and driven more by accumulated frustration than strategic thinking. Burke was accused directly of involvement in the disappearances. His response was predictable: rage, denial, threats. He was no saint, he admitted, had done things he was not proud of, but he was not a murderer and certainly not part of any organized predation. The confrontation nearly became physical, prevented only by William's intervention and Margaret's shouted reminder that violence would solve nothing. Burke left the area within days, driven out by suspicion and hostile atmosphere. It felt like victory initially, like removing a threat, but the feeling proved short-lived. Investigation revealed Burke had solid alibis for several of the earlier disappearances. He had not even been in the region during some of them. The time frame of his presence did not match the pattern of incidents. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a rough man with a difficult past, trying to survive through honest, if temporary, work. The wrong suspect, an innocent person driven out by misdirected suspicion. The shame of this mistake settled heavily. Burke had been targeted because he looked dangerous, because he fit certain prejudices about who commits violence, because it was easier to blame a stranger than to accept the uncomfortable possibility that the danger came from someone more familiar. The error revealed how desperately the need for answers had become, how that desperation could corrupt judgment and create injustice even while pursuing justice. Margaret demanded a conversation that had been delayed too long. She spoke with controlled fury about the cost of obsession. A man falsely accused and driven from the area. The tavern's reputation damaged by public confrontation. The marriage strained to breaking by years of divided attention. She had been patient, she had been supportive, but patience had limits. Either the investigation needed to proceed with more care and less consuming intensity, or it needed to be abandoned entirely before it destroyed everything they had built. The ultimatum forced a reckoning. The investigation had become more about personal need than actual justice. The pursuit of answers had replaced the life that gave those answers meaning. Success in solving the mystery would mean nothing if the cost was the marriage, the business, the relationships that made life worth protecting. The choice was not between investigation and abandonment, but between obsessive destruction and disciplined persistence. The decision came through painful honesty. The investigation would continue, but within strict boundaries, specific hours allocated, not consuming every spare moment. No more public confrontations, no more pursuing theories without adequate evidence. And most importantly, remembering that the tavern was not merely a location relevant to the mystery, but a home and livelihood that required primary attention and care. Daniel proved instrumental in helping re-establish balance. He took on additional responsibilities willingly, freeing up time for both investigation and personal life. He showed no offense at occasionally being excluded from sensitive discussions. Even trusted friends did not need to know everything. His steady competence and good humor helped restore some of the tavern's atmosphere that had been lost during the worst of the obsessive period. Winter approached again, marking years now since the investigation had begun in earnest. Progress felt maddeningly slow, measured in accumulated observations rather than clear breakthroughs. But the leather journal had grown thick, the correspondence extensive, the network of concerned innkeepers and merchants now spanning several days' travel in multiple directions. Something was being built, even if its final form remained unclear. Knowledge was accumulating. Eventually, knowledge became understanding. And understanding, if fortune proved kind, might become justice. The letter arrived in early spring, folded neatly, sealed with wax, bearing no mark of station. The handwriting was tidy, without flourish, signed only by initials that meant nothing. It claimed to come from a merchant named Jonathan Pierce, bound northward with goods and seeking reliable accommodations along the trade route. There was nothing remarkable in the request itself. Travelers often wrote ahead to secure lodging. But something in the phrasing, the deliberate mention of safety, stirred attention. The message promised arrival within a week. By now, years of watchfulness had trained instinct. The pattern had changed subtly these past months. Fewer vanishings, longer intervals, but an unmistakable sense of survival rather than resolution. The predator was still out there, perhaps wary, perhaps waiting. The tavern remained a place of passing figures, each stranger carrying the potential for clarity or catastrophe. Daniel brought the letter in from the post messenger, his face curious. He had grown into his role fully now, confident, trusted, almost family. He asked whether the traveler should receive a room at the back, where noise stayed minimal. Yes, came the answer. Best to keep things as ordinary as possible. Yet inwardly, certain expectations began forming quietly, like ripples beneath still water. Jonathan Pierce arrived 5 days later, precisely as promised. Older than anticipated, his hands rough from work, his face open in the unguarded way of someone inclined toward honesty. The sort who spoke to strangers easily, who trusted words and faces until given reason not to. He shared stories about his business, grain, leather goods, and small mercantile items, and laughed often, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the rafters. That laugh would make it harder to think of him later as bait, but perhaps that was what made the plan feel less cruel and more necessary. William returned soon after, having been summoned with a carefully coded note. He looked thinner. His eyes ringed with fatigue, but his presence steadied the air like weight against wind. Together he and the innkeeper laid out their quiet design. No traps set, no bait offered directly. Only watchfulness. Every small movement, every question, every shadow on the road, observed, recorded, compared. The hope was simple, that the culprit, whoever had used trusted inns to target travelers, might return to familiar hunting grounds unaware that the ground beneath had shifted. Margaret listened as the plan unfolded, her silence measuring its reason and its folly. She had seen too much loss, too many false leads, to trust easy optimism. Yet this was different, controlled, deliberate, shaped by patience rather than obsession. She closed her ledger, looked across the lamplit table, and said only, "Then we'll keep the door open and candles lit." It meant both hospitality and vigilance, the uneasy balance they had learned to live in. That evening they ate with Pierce. He asked questions about the northern road, though only in the ordinary way of a traveler confirming conditions. He spoke of another inn he had passed 2 days prior, one that looked respectable but seemed oddly empty. Its keeper, he said, had been too eager to know his plans, too eager to recommend a resting spot farther north. The description struck sharply, details matching an inn already known for its connection to disappeared travelers. The coincidence was too exact to ignore. When Pierce retired upstairs, the three remaining in the kitchen, William, Margaret, and the innkeeper, spoke in low tones. The pattern seemed poised to repeat itself. Another wealthy traveler on the same stretch. Another disappearance waiting to happen. But this time, if fortune favored them, evidence might be followed rather than found too late. The decision came quietly. Daniel would check the road in early morning to confirm whether anyone watched the tavern approaches. He volunteered readily, cheerful about the prospect of being useful. Morning broke gray with mist. The innkeeper watched Daniel lead the horse from the stable, his figure vanishing into fog that carried the smell of thawed earth. Hours passed uneasily. William sorted through the correspondence and earlier notes. Margaret baked, kneading bread with sharp, rhythmic precision. The kettle sang loudly in the silence. When Daniel returned near noon, his face shone with satisfaction. "No one on the road," he reported. "Clear for miles." It should have been comfort, yet the words tightened something inside. Daniel never failed in detail, but his timing felt too perfect, his certainty too complete. Watching him move about the kitchen, joking lightly about travelers, there came the faint recognition of habit unseen before. How Daniel always seemed to know when someone was due to arrive, always seemed near when important letters came. Trust, once cracked, made every memory reopen for examination. Days passed uneventfully. Pierce stayed a second night due to worsening weather. By the third morning, the sun rose in clear quiet, and he prepared to depart. Farewells were exchanged warmly. He promised to stop again on the return journey. His horse snorted against the cold air, hooves striking frost-bound earth. Then he disappeared down the northern road. The innkeeper watched until the sound faded beyond the curve of trees. For a moment, everything felt intolerably still. William remained another day, unwilling to leave until some news arrived confirming Pierce's safe passage. But no messenger came. By the following evening, anxiety coiled tight inside like wound rope. The decision formed abruptly. They would follow. Leaving Margaret to manage the inn, the two men departed at daybreak, taking only necessary provisions. The road north wound through forest thick with pine and memory. They found signs almost immediately, hoof tracks leading off the main road at a steep angle. Broken branches told of struggle nearby, and then, cruelly familiar, a scattering of personal belongings half buried in old leaves. A torn piece of saddlebag, crushed oats, a fragment of wax-sealed letters. The pattern, perfect and terrible, repeating again. A body lay farther off, half concealed behind moss and roots. The recognition came too fast to allow denial. They buried him there with rough grace, as one does when the world refuses order. Nothing else could be recovered except the familiar signs of organized theft. Yet something new lingered amid the despair. A set of boot prints, different from Pierce's, leading back toward a direction that should have led nowhere but the tavern. William's face turned grim. They followed the trail silently. It ended where the forest thinned near the old mill, long abandoned since the stream changed course years ago. Inside, the air stank of damp and rot. Broken barrels littered corners, and in one, half hidden beneath burlap, they found what years of searching had only hinted at: packs and purses, trinkets, scraps of blood-stained fabric. Objects from multiple victims, each carrying silent testimony to their violent ends. More shocking than discovery was recognition. Among the items lay a small brass button bearing Daniel's initials, part of the shirt gifted to him 2 winters prior for his loyal service. Beside it, a sealed pouch containing coins from 2 known victims. The logic of all previous doubts rearranged itself abruptly into clarity. Everything, the eagerness, the ideal help, the convenient timing, the perfect knowledge of travelers, folded together into a single unbearable conclusion. He had used proximity as camouflage, loyalty as cover. Each arrival had been an opportunity, travelers spoke freely at taverns, unaware of what information they revealed: routes, wealth, companions. Daniel noted details, followed later under pretext of errands, or sent word to accomplices who waited along the way. Safety itself had become his instrument of betrayal. They confronted him before dawn 2 days later. He had returned from some errand, his demeanor unchanged. The quiet inside the tavern felt colder than the air outside. When asked directly about the mill and the hidden goods, he did not deny knowledge, merely tilted his head, studied them with faint amusement, and said, "You saw what you were meant to see." The calmness of the response chilled the room more than shouting could have. William reached for the pistol he rarely carried. Daniel's eyes flicked toward it with disinterest. His speech held neither anger nor apology, only a mild disappointment that his usefulness had ended. When pressed why, for how long, with whom, his answers offered fragments without names, like confessions written to mislead rather than reveal. In the end, restraint replaced words. Rope and waiting for the constable. He sat bound by the cold hearth until daylight. Margaret did not speak to him. The look she offered once was not hatred, but disbelief, the collapsing of every kindness shared into ruin. When Constable Peters arrived, he took the captive with official sternness mixed with astonishment. Packed evidence filled half the constable's cart. Quiet finally returned after the sound of wheels faded from the road. That day lingered longer than any winter. The realization that evil had dwelt under the same roof, eaten at the same table, laughed among them for years, this knowledge would not leave easily. Yet beneath grief, something else stirred. An exhausted relief that the searching had ended, that knowledge, even bitter, had at last replaced endless guessing. Night came softly. William sat by the fire, silent for once, his gaze distant toward the forest. Margaret cleaned the table with measured precision. The innkeeper stood watching flame dance against iron, thinking not of justice achieved, but of the narrow thread between trust and blindness, and how often people crossed it without noticing. Winter came late that year, carried in by slow, deliberate winds that turned roads to glass and trees to frozen sentinels. The aftermath of discovery had reshaped everything at the tavern. Though outward life returned to familiar rhythm, firewood stacked high, stoves burning, travelers passing through, beneath it ran a quiet current of tension and fatigue. The constable's visits, the questioning, the formal statements, all left behind an invisible residue that clung to every conversation. Daniel had confessed more during transport to the county jail, at least according to Constable Peters. The gang was small but well organized. They preyed on trade routes, stretching from the Vermont mountainsides down toward the New Hampshire border. Daniel selected victims through his work, sending word by written notes carried secretly with merchants who owed the gang debts. The accomplices waited along the road, attacking when conditions provided best advantage: dense forest, failing light, predictable solitude. The pattern's precision had been his doing. He had said other things, too, about how easily people trusted vigilance that looked like loyalty, how weakness of character lay not in greed, but in misplaced faith. Some dismissed these as boasting, others as attempts to wound those who had offered him kindness. The innkeeper never heard the exact words and had no wish to. The damage done required no further description. The trial came weeks later in the nearest township courthouse. Snow fell the morning they departed for it, heavy flakes muffling the wheels of the hired wagon. Margaret rode beside, silent, trunked in layers of wool to keep out the cold. William followed on horseback. In the courthouse, the air smelled of old wood, iron hinges, and too many bodies packed in narrow space. Curious citizens filled benches to witness confession, punishment, spectacle. Daniel looked smaller under chains, pale against rough stone walls. His smile, the easy, habitual one once used to reassure guests, appeared again briefly as his eyes caught familiar faces across the courtroom. It was not apology, but recognition. The proceedings themselves were swift. His partial confession, the piles of evidence retrieved from the old mill, and witness testimony left little room for doubt. Others captured along the roads had already confessed to receiving information from him. Sentence came without passion. Execution, to be carried out publicly at month's end. It disturbed less than expected. The human voice announcing judgment sounded ordinary, professional, as if reciting a weather report. When it ended, the room exhaled as one. Afterward, silence held the walk back to the wagon. Only when the road curved beyond the settlement did Margaret speak. She asked whether guilt felt lighter now that justice had arrived. The answer came after long thought. Guilt no longer fit the feeling. It was heavier, subtler, something closer to mourning for misplaced trust. If evil had any skill, it was in learning to mimic goodness convincingly. Returning home, they found the tavern changed not in form, but in spirit. Word of capture had spread quickly, and travelers returned reluctantly at first, then more willingly. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Some came just to glimpse the place connected to such events, expecting traces of violence or mystery. Instead, they found warmth, decent meals, polite conversation, ordinary comforts carried out with deliberate calm. The innkeeper refused to speak publicly about Daniel. Rumor would supply all color needed. Truth, offered quietly, required silence to retain dignity. Winter deepened. Nights stretched long, the fire snapping against logs cut months before. Those months brought small acts of rebuilding, a new lock on the storage shed, repairs to stable doors once maintained by Daniel's careful hands. William stayed often, helping with supplies and bringing items from distant towns. He had stopped mercantile work that year, speaking only of needing time away from roots that had become haunted territory in memory. Margaret's steadiness became the axis around which this quiet restoration turned. She worked with measured energy, practical as ever, yet moments arrived when her gaze fixed on nothing visible, as if still listening for a sound that finally had ceased. The innkeeper understood it without words. After all, the betrayal had struck every soul in that household, not only one. Early spring brought final correspondence from the courthouse, confirmation that the execution had taken place. The letter, formal and brief, noted confiscated property to be auctioned for restitution. No one mentioned attending. The world moved forward regardless, carts rolling, goods trading, lives continuing. History rarely paused for moral balance. That same week, a small group of travelers stopped during a heavy rain. Among them were relatives of one of the victims, a woman and her grown son, who had come north to collect personal effects recovered from the gang's horde. They stayed 2 nights, speaking little, carrying grief compacted into politeness. Before leaving, the woman lingered in the doorway, her hand on the ledger. "You tried to stop him," she said softly. "That counts." Kindness from the grieving can wound more than accusation. The words followed long after their departure, replayed against sleepless nights. Had enough been done? Could anyone have seen through that easy smile sooner? These thoughts circled without destination, until William interrupted one evening with the practical suggestion of marking the end with some symbol, something visible, not as memorial to Daniel or his victims, but as boundary where the past ended and rebuilding could begin. Together, they cleared a small patch near the edge of the property, where tree roots forked like old scars. There they placed a simple stone, carved only with the words, "For those who pass this way." No dates, no explanations, only acknowledgement of suffering and passage. When finished, Margaret set a small lantern beside it, lighting it as dusk fell. The flame caught wind briefly, then burned steady. The tavern's rhythm gradually recovered. New workers were brought in, carefully vetted, always under quiet watch. The old routines returned, but carried new meaning. Every coin taken, every meal served, every door locked at night. Mundane acts elevated by awareness of how fragile order could be when trust was misplaced. Constable Peters visited one last time before summer. This time, not in investigative capacity, but out of gratitude. He admitted with embarrassed honesty that the persistence shown years earlier had prevented far greater damage. The gangs operating along the border had begun to unravel following Daniel's capture. Too many confessions pointed to too many others. The roads, for the first time in years, were declared safe enough for unaccompanied travel. Progress, built on grief. Yet safety itself felt like an uncertain word. Peace arrived not as comfort, but as space emptied of threat. There were evenings when wind whisked down the chimney in a way that mimicked approaching footsteps, and each time the mind turned briefly toward that dark memory, before reason reasserted itself, reminding that the past, though not forgotten, was closed. Late one night, William found the innkeeper writing again in the familiar leather journal, though the entries now lacked tension. They spoke instead of prices, weather, travelers stealing chickens from nearby farms, a reminder that common life reemerges given enough time. He smiled faintly, remarking that habit sometimes outlasts purpose. The response came quietly. Habits are how we carry memory until it softens. Weeks later, a messenger brought news of another road farther west still plagued by disappearances, possibly an imitator or remnant group. The message produced only tired contemplation. Evil was persistent, perhaps inevitable, but rare was the chance to confront it directly. They had faced theirs and endured. Others would have to face their own. Summer advanced. Orchards blossomed early. Bees thickened the air. Travelers increased, bringing songs and laughter that sounded foreign after long years of whispers and watchfulness. For the first time in memory, laughter returned to the tavern for its own sake. Margaret hummed again while she worked, not the same melodies as before, but new ones, shaped by the life that remained. Sometimes in the stillness between customers, the innkeeper stepped outside to stand by the small stone near the edge of the property. Grass now grew around it, and the lantern, replaced weekly, glowed faintly even in daylight's last reach. There was no sense of victory there, only of balance, life continuing its patient repair. When William prepared to depart south that autumn, promising return before winter, their farewell carried none of the heaviness of earlier partings. The work was not done, but it no longer ruled them. As his horse disappeared down the same road once marked by fear, the innkeeper turned back toward the tavern. Smoke curled upward from the chimney. The scent of bread drifted through the open door, and the voices within rose in ordinary conversation. The world outside remained uncertain, as it always had. But inside, the lamps burned steady, casting warm light across wooden beams polished by years of use. And for that moment, after long darkness and damaged trust, it was enough to stand quietly at the threshold, feeling something close to peace take root again. Autumn came softly to Wentworth Gap that year, the hills awash with gold and deeper amber. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the sky carried that curious hush that falls when nature begins folding in upon itself. The road outside the inn lay quiet most mornings, veiled in pale fog until the sun crept high enough to warm the earth again. Inside, peace had taken form not in silence, but in gentler sounds. The scrape of chairs, the creak of floorboards, the murmur of voices that no longer whispered in worry. The inn had changed once more. Its fear weathered down to something smaller, something almost tender. Life had reclaimed it, as moss reclaims fallen wood. By early light, the proprietor moved through familiar rooms, laying kindling, straightening chairs, tending the fire before guests stirred. These small routines had become their own language of gratitude. Work continued with deliberate steadiness, not from need, but from the quiet wish that everything remain orderly now that the storm had passed. The crackle of firewood, the scent of maple cakes in the oven, the rustle of sheets aired in the sun, all conspired toward one truth. Survival carried music of its own. Margaret managed the ledgers still, her handwriting neat as ever. Her hair had turned silver at the temples, though it suited her. She laughed easily again, and sometimes, in the lull between chores, she spoke to travelers as though she had never known sorrow. Only in the evenings, when she sat alone by the window and the sky turned violet, did her brightness dim. Her gaze wandered beyond the road, to the forest where old ghosts seemed to wait just beyond sight. William returned as the first frost glazed the ground. He stayed several days, bringing small gifts from his travels, a bolt of fine wool, a jar of preserved pears from the southern colonies, a book bound in faded leather. He spoke of calmer roads, of merchants traveling once again without fear, of how farmers could send goods to market without escorts. Each story of safety, each account of movement restored, landed softly in the heart that had carried guilt for too long. His friendship had deepened into something steady and unspoken, where gratitude and respect blurred into quiet affection. They shared no promises, none were needed. Both knew that life's truest companionship often avoided declarations altogether. William left as the snow began to fall, his figure shrinking against white hillsides, and the tavern swallowed him once more into distance. The inn's new helper, a young woman named Ruth, had arrived earlier that season. Barely grown but quick-handed and bright-eyed, she carried the restless energy of someone eager to learn and leave her mark. Margaret trained her carefully, teaching the arts of patience, how to sense when a pot was ready without stirring too often, how to read a traveler's temper before serving his ale. The innkeeper watched their camaraderie grow with quiet warmth. Life, after all, renews itself through such apprenticeships, as one story begins while another softens toward its end. Each evening, after the guests had retired, came the ritual of closing. Bolts drawn across doors, embers banked just enough to hold heat until morning, shutters fastened against wind that moaned softly through the valley. Then came the walk outside, lantern in hand, down the sloping path to the small stone at the property's edge. For those who passed this way. The words had faded slightly from seasons of rain and snow, yet they retained their dignity. The flame within the glass always wavered, but never went out. It was tended not from superstition but remembrance, the belief that what we owe the dead is not grief but continuance. Sometimes travelers asked about the stone. They heard stories from other towns, embroidered through retelling. Bandits hanged, ghosts haunting the trade road, curses laid by angry spirits. The innkeeper always replied simply that it was to honor those who did not reach their journey's ends, and left it at that. Truth, once known, rarely required retelling to retain its power. One such traveler, an elderly scholar journeying from Boston to Montreal, stayed several nights while storms made the passes impassable. Over supper, he spoke of philosophy and human nature, of whether goodness could ever be more than habit. The conversation meandered toward the nature of justice, how once attained it seldom satisfies entirely. The innkeeper listened, then said quietly, not to challenge but to share, that justice, when finally reached, does not erase wrong. It merely allows the living to look ahead again without flinching. The scholar nodded thoughtfully and raised his cup. That winter proved harsh but beautiful. The roads gleamed pale under moonlight, horses' hooves striking sparks on frozen ground. The inn remained lively, serving both travelers and locals who came for warmth and news. There were nights of laughter again, cards played by candlelight, fiddles singing, while snow fell quietly outside. The past no longer waited in every shadow. Its edges had softened, like footprints blurring under new snow. Still, some nights carried their own silence. When Margaret slept and the fires burned low, the innkeeper sat awake by the window, thinking of those early years, the child hauling water, the dying mother's hands, the father's watchful eyes, the years of effort that built this place beam by beam. All of it, even the pain, seemed to converge here, a life measured by labor, and by the endurance that labor required. It was a small thing, perhaps, to keep one tavern running on a distant road, but it had contained everything. Trust, betrayal, grief, and the hard work of rebuilding faith once broken. The journal used during the investigation still existed, though now its pages held different entries. Notes on barrel inventories, on trade prices, on suppliers. Nothing dramatic, just evidence of an ordinary life reclaimed. Yet sometimes, in spare space between figures, appeared a line or two of thought not meant for record, but for remembrance. No vigilance without kindness. No justice without humility. Spring crept back in subtle layers, the drip of thaw, the smell of wet earth, the sound of birds tentatively testing song. Travelers began appearing early, most of them new faces, unaware of the history embedded in these walls. They found warmth, fair prices, conversation when desired, and silence when not. For them, it was simply the best stop between towns. For the keepers, it was the continuation of a promise to protect those who passed through, even when protection could only mean a meal and safe rest. By midsummer, the forest had swallowed most signs of the old mill. Grass covered the clearing, birds nested where greed had once hidden. Occasionally, curiosity drove the innkeeper out that way, more to ensure the place stayed empty than from superstition. The creek sang on, indifferent to memory. The world, it seemed, was mercifully uninterested in human tragedy. Years leave their marks most quietly. The hair turns pale, movements slow. But the mind learns patience that youth never knew. The tavern now belonged as much to Margaret as to Ruth, the rhythms of its care shared among hands younger and steadier. The days shortened again, as they always would, yet the passing of time felt less threat and more continuity. One evening, after seeing to the guests, the innkeeper walked to the porch and sat watching the lantern lights flicker along the trade road. A wagon passed, wheels crunching over gravel, driver humming a tune. The moment felt suspended between past and future. A road safer now because people had cared enough to act, yet never entirely free from danger, because life itself never is. There were no grand reckonings left to make, no revelations waiting, only the quiet comfort of endurance fully lived. He looked toward the forest's dark line, breathed in the scent of pine and distant rain, then turned back toward the inn where firelight pooled golden through the windows. Inside waited warmth, conversation, another evening of humanity's ceaseless, ordinary grace. And for the first time in many years, when he closed the door against the night, it felt not like guarding against the world, but joining it peacefully.